You're listening to Talking Law, the podcast where business owners just like you discover how to avoid legal landmines and build value using smart legal tips.
Hi, it's Joanna Oakey here and welcome back to Talking Law. Now, in this episode, we've decided to bless your feeds with a podcast replay. We've identified the most popular and most listened to episodes and we have them running through your audio waves again. Now, today we have on the show Josh Taylor of Taylor Insolvency talking all about what to do when things go bad in your business, how to identify issues that might lead to questions about solvency of the business, and what to do about it when that happens. We cover some really interesting topics in today's discussion, so buckle in. Here's our podcast replay. Josh, thank you so much for joining us today on Talking Law. It's great to have you on the show.
Well, thank you for having me. It's exciting to be here.
Fabulous. Okay, now look, I really wanted to drill into this concept of when things go bad for an organization. And I love stories, so I thought it'd be great if we had you on the podcast talking about what it looks like when things go bad, and then maybe even some tips and tricks for our listeners as to the things that they can do, I guess, to help ward off issues or identify them early enough. So maybe kicking into it, I guess, why are we talking about this topic, Josh? I mean, obviously you see day in, day out the sad stories of where things have gone wrong in a business and that have ended up exploding. And so you've obviously seen a lot of themes that come up again and again and again in that sort of story.
Yeah, so the main themes in terms of for micro businesses, smaller businesses in the personal space are relationship breakdowns. Divorce can often lead down the path of financial instability, gambling, lifestyle issues, and just slowdowns in businesses, which can't be matched by a slowdown in lifestyle. So they're the four main ones, and then the people you see who are owed money at the end of that is you always see lots of ATO debt. You see lease debts on leases with personal guarantees and all that sort of stuff. You see debts to the major four banks for personal loans, credit cards, and other lenders, where oftentimes people keep getting more loans to pay off old loans and they just end up in a bit of a circle of debt.
Yeah. And sorry, just to stop you for a second, you sort of talked about micro and super small business, but many of our listeners and our clients are sort of around that mid-size SME as well, mid and quite often large SMEs. And presumably, well, I guess you tell us, do you see more of the micro than the, mid to large SMEs in financial difficulty, or are the mid to large, SMEs still as exposed, but just in different ways?
Definitely. So the more successful you are, probably the more exposed you are, because the exposure to financial difficulty comes from people who have monies going out at a higher rate than money's coming in. And oftentimes on the micro scale or in smaller scale, people are pretty disciplined with their budgeting. To take it to the extreme end, people who are on some sort of welfare system, they know exactly how much they're getting each week, and they pretty much spend the same amount each week. So you don't fall into as much difficulty there as what you'd expect. It's when you are running a smaller business, you might have a turnover of $1, $2, $5, $10 million, and that turnover goes down. And so those reasons are still the same reasons. The first major one, again, in small business is it's usually driven by someone. It might be driven by Joanna Oakey, it might be driven by Josh Taylor, it might be driven by Bob Smith. But if that Bob Smith, Josh Taylor, Joanna Oakey has a relationship breakdown, they don't have their mind on the game. And all of the things that drive business through, both getting business, working on the business, and getting the customer satisfied out the door, starts falling to pieces because our mind's elsewhere.
And I totally agree. And the other thing that we see is where, we're talking here about the relationships of the individuals outside of the business. We quite often see relationships of individuals within the business. So say, for example, business partnerships, where there's a breakdown within the business that can really have an impact on performance. But the other thing that I see that I often find trumps everything else is fast growth. I feel that fast growth is actually one of the most vulnerable periods for businesses that we see, because quite often there's this mismatch in the understanding between revenue, profit, and cash flow, because it's that cash flow that, as they're growing really quickly, can be really, really caught up and can cause massive problems. Is that something that you also see as an issue?
Yeah, so definitely if people don't have strong advisors behind them, or people are afraid to reach out, that does happen. Usually, though, with strong growth, you're in a better position than people who are going the other way.
Yeah.
So take, for example, you're better off being the Uber than the taxi driver.
Yeah.
So the taxi driver who's just had his market reduced 70%, better off being the guy who's taken 70% of that market. So it's just a matter of perspective, but certainly there are traps with people where they think, okay, I've just signed my first $5 million contract. I'm going to go spend $5 million today. And then they spend that money, and then they've got to keep recurring. They don't have other contracts. And then they're just in a world of pain.
Exactly. And particularly where that contract that's worth 5 million, because that's such a good example, because it can sometimes be these really large contracts, that contract where, there might be 5 million. The turnover of that cash is very slow. Say, for example, the client stops paying or is very, very slow in paying, and you've had to pay out a lot of your expenses along the way. So I guess there can be these cash crunches from what looks to be like a great event. You know what I mean? If you've not got if you're not used to growth. So maybe let's reflect on some of those stories that are most memorable for you, Josh, for where things have gone bad. What are some of those examples that you've got that really stick out clearly in your mind?
Okay, so since cash and growth is the number one talking topic of where we're going, I recently had a client who was in the IT space doing contracts for other larger companies, which everybody would know in the software marketing internet type space, without giving away any names. And they had very large contracts, and they were growing really fast. The problem they had is a fundamental misunderstanding of both how you pay your employees. When you pay your employees, you've got to pay gross wages, not just what cash goes out every week or every fortnight. And a misunderstanding of the value of yourself and what it is your customers are purchasing. So this individual, he started getting some good contracts, and he was good at what he did. So he kept getting more contracts, and he decided, I'm going to work on the business. He instead of in the business, which is always good. I'm a fan of working on the business, in the business, around the business, and everywhere to do with the business. But he put together a board for himself and put together a bunch of very high paying positions, which he did some basic maths, which I can only be described on the net figures, and then soon found himself in trouble.
Yeah.
Because if you go and put yourself together a board where it's costing you $1 million, $2 million just for people to essentially do what you were doing by yourself yesterday, that's going to put any pressure on any medium-sized company.
Yeah.
And then he's just treading water, and he's effectively using the ATO as a bank. So he's not paying his PAYG, he's not paying his GST, he's not paying his super. He comes to his accountant tells him to go see Josh. So he comes to see myself, and we work through the issues and the potential solution for that company. And without putting exact numbers, by the time he comes and sees us, he's he owes the ATO well over $500,000, $800,000 in PAYG, GST, and he owes his employees maybe 70, 80 grand, according to the books and records of his company in super. He says, look, I've got aside 200 grand to settle this. Can we do it with 200 grand? We say, yes, if you got 200 grand and the company can afford to pay us the administrator's costs on the way through, we think we can get the ATO across the line where they'll agree to take 200 grand. Now, keep in mind that those sorts of deals are only generally available in an administration type process. You're not going to be able to get your accountant to talk to the ATO and get them to take off hard actual debt. Your accountant, generally speaking, will be able to get rid of penalties, interest, all of that sort of stuff. But if you've lodged BASs, which say you've got tax that you've got to pay and hold on behalf of your employees, the ATO is not going to forget about that in the ordinary course of business. But through the voluntary administration process, they're going to take a more high-level view as to what's better for the country, what's better for this company, what's better for those employees, and they'll have a look at it. Okay, so we go all guns a-blazing. The administrators, myself, appointed, and we continue to trade the company on as we put together a report for the ATO to essentially take this money. During this time, we go through the employee super, and they're owed a lot more than that original sort of 50 to 70 grand that we thought was owed. And by the time we issue our report to the ATO, it's already up closer to 100 grand. For the
employees in relation to the super.
In relation to the super. Keeping in mind that the employees and employee entitlements, when they're owed money, they get paid before the general body of the creditors, which includes the ATO for GST and PAYG. So we issued the report. We're still on board. We still think it's better for the ATO to accept this $200,000, of which $100,000 would be to pay off super, $100,000 would be going to them. So they're only getting, I think that's about 15 cents in the dollar at this particular point in time. Okay, but you take it away and you've lost 20, 25 really good jobs. Those 20, 25 jobs are supporting 20, 25 families. You're losing the taxes from that. You're losing the mental ability and know-how. These people, they're not, well, besides COVID, they're not stuck in Australia in terms of their skills. They've got skills that they can go work in San Francisco, they can go pay taxes and contribute to many different societies. So we're still very positive on this, but we're not sure how much is owed to super because it's just going up and up and up. Now, the process is once we issue a report to the ATO saying this is the deal, a week later a meeting is held at my office between myself, the director, and all the creditors to decide whether they'll accept this deal or whether the company needs to go under. During that week, we keep chipping away at the outstanding super, working through more documents, speaking to more employees, finding out what we can find, speaking to more people in the ATO super team, which is different to effectively their liquidation administration deals team, so to speak. And by the time the meeting is held, the amount of super that's owed is now $250,000. So we now are offering the ATO, less money than what's owed in super. So they're going to get nothing. Their debt, $700,000, $800,000, completely wiped. The super, even the employees, they're going to be ripped off 50 grand. The employees, we have a meeting with the employees beforehand to tell them this. Employees want to go because keep in mind, although 50 grand sounds like a lot when you dilute it amongst that many employees, you keep in mind this is their job. Company goes under. They've got to go find a new job and go through that process.
And so the importance is you had to essentially get all of these people to agree that it's better for the company to stay alive and to continue trading on the basis that you've come to this deal in relation to a reduced payout to each of, to the ATO and to each of the employees. And so this is part of your work in trying to keep the doors open so that the business post this can trade on.
Correct, because for businesses such as this one, they do have a bright future. They're just They've just been compromised by mistakes of the past. And if you can package that compromise together in a financial arrangement, which meets with the Corporations Act and meets with what everybody's willing to accept, then there's no reason to keep going. Obviously, it'd be better if everybody paid everything all the time they owed.
But you're saying in this instance they couldn't. So sort of the decision is close the doors, employees lose their job, the funds are liquidated, the assets in the business are liquidated, and everyone takes what they can, or we come to this compromise and allow the business to keep trading, and hopefully after that, you know, be on a positive footing, and then from there on forth be able to pay their taxes and their employees along the way. And so what happened here in this instance? Did everyone end up agreeing?
And so in this instance, the short answer is everybody did end up agreeing. The reason they do end up agreeing, or they ended up agreeing in this one, is the creditors and the ATO looks at a few things. One, what they'll get in the liquidation. If the doors are shut, what happens then? Okay. And this is the only sort of formal process or time that happens. Oftentimes people will threaten, if you don't take this deal, I'll put it into liquidation. That's usually people don't respond too well to that type of negotiation. This isn't done in a threatening way. This is just done in a formal process. You've got two doors to open, either this one or that one, because it is the creditor's choice. It's their choice. So if you open this one, it'll go in this direction. And the second one is we point out, and that's at least part of what I see is our role, the intangible factors to the ATO, because the ATO, unlike other institutional creditors, whilst they care about the return to the ATO, they have a big care factor on what the right thing to do by the Australian people, the country, is. And so they won't just take into account the cents in the dollar return, whereas certain institutions, they might require 10 cents, 20 cents, all the way up to 70, 80, 90 to full repayment of the debt before they'll agree to anything.
Yeah.
The ATO takes a more sort of holistic, everything approach to the decisions they make. So the end game result of that is this guy, instead of living day to day, week to week with a company burdened by getting close to $1 million worth of debt and superannuation, which whether he knew it or didn't know it was $250,000. For $200,000, he's paid his employees as super. One would like to hope that, you know, it all works out moving forward. And he's also just completely wiped out ATO debt. Now, I wouldn't suggest that sort of circumstance to any listeners as you're moving forward, because you need a better offer generally. It's just, it happened naturally like that. And so you can get to the result sometimes, but that result was obviously much better than what we anticipated at the start.
Yeah. And of course the risk for the director, had he have not pulled the cord and gone and sought proper advice at the time he did, was an exposure to personal liability as well, surely.
So personal liability in these sorts of situations are twofold. When you get a DPN issued against you, now most rational people will go and see
that's a director penalty notice, for DPN, for those listeners who don't know the acronym DPN. Sorry, keep going, Josh.
Yeah, so when someone gets a notice like that, you should definitely call your accountant or your solicitor. Joanna, I'm sure you're happy to walk people through the process when that happens. And the other way is if you don't lodge your tax returns within 3 months of their due date. So if your BASs are outside 3 months of the due date, you can get locked down to personal liability without even a DPN. So even if you can't pay your BASs, make sure you lodge them. The ATO brought that in because they're sick of people not lodging or using that as an excuse. What people would often do was they'd come in and see an accountant with 5 years of lodgements not done because they're behind, and they didn't want to do them and get a DPN against their name, a director's penalty notice. So their accountant would send them on to the liquidator, and the liquidator would liquidate the company, and the director, in all likelihood, might have avoided personal liability because the ATO never got the chance. Whereas this way, they've got a way of automatically getting you. So always keep in touch with your accountants and your lawyers. And look, most accountants these days, they offer sort of fixed price and sort of monthly service arrangements, which I'd encourage people to use. And I say that I'm not a general practice accountant, but I don't like, even me I have a general practice accountant, I don't like the arrangements where you're concerned to speak with someone because of the cost. Yeah. Whereas like the good lawyers out there, Joanna, they'll always take your call without charging you to have a chat before but accountants, people are a bit more nervous about. Accountants are a bit more rule based, and so you can make sure you get yourself into a good arrangement there.
I think the other thing, though, to mention and be super clear about is the risk also for directors in insolvent trading.
The risk, so there's a couple of risks. The first risk that everybody talks about is insolvent trading, and that's because it's probably the easiest case for a liquidator to make against a director. So it's the largest risk. There's also other risks like directors' duties, and where you might see that is where you see people sort of rip stuff out of companies and enter into transactions that a director shouldn't be entering into. There's also specific sections of the Corporations Act that attack those transactions as well. So if it's not just a general thing, if you can specifically show something in particular. And personal guarantees. So when people have signed personal guarantees, be aware of that. If your company goes into liquidation, in all likelihood, the creditor who has a personal guarantee is going to go after you personally. And that links in with director penalty notices and ATO lockdown DPN. So if you owe the ATO $1 million, you're much better off owing the ATO $1 million, which they can't get to you personally. Okay, because then it can just go with the company, pending that you don't have any insolvent trading type risk. Insolvent trading, to spend a bit more time on that, it's where you've kept incurring debts where a reasonable person knew that you were insolvent. Okay, so if you keep incurring debts at a time when you're insolvent, now there'll be a lot of argument about when you were not insolvent, and there's a few defences nowadays. There was the coronavirus defence for last year, which kept you out of insolvent trading. Basically, if you were going down because of the coronavirus, you weren't going to get done. There's now the safe harbour defence. So if you spoke to a solicitor who was strong in this, again, like give Joanna a call and she walks you through, okay, let's get a strategy to try and turn this around. Then you can invoke what's called the safe harbour type defence. So where you say to the court, look, I took steps to try and make things better. Me trading wasn't making it worse. I was trying to make it better. It's just that the business had gone that bad, or the market was that bad that it kept going negative. And here we are.
And so I think, like the takeaway of all of this is, if your organization is suffering really, difficulties in you being able to pay debts when they fall due, that's really the test. If you're suffering a cash crunch, you really need to seek us early. And, get serious about it, because there are a number of things that can be established along the way where you've had the right advice along the way. But organisations, I just always have this memory of when I was a junior solicitor, we had a client come into the firm that I was practicing at the time. And he just had this horrific story of this really fast growth business. He'd done, really well. It was related to the construction industry, where he had a really big client that just stopped paying. And, and this can happen, certainly can happen very regularly in the building construction industry, but it can happen in any industry where you're particularly exposed to a small number of clients that could create a cash crunch if they stop paying for some reason. And ultimately what happened in the end was just because he was so exposed, had left it so late to get advice, there was nothing that could be done at the time. And he ended up in a discussion with his accountant and a liquidator. The business ended up going down. He ended up in personal bankruptcy because of all of the personal guarantees that he'd signed, because he'd come to this too late. His marriage ended up in tatters. And, he came into the office one day and was just talking to me. And and he was in tears because his business had imploded and had been this, on this massively huge growth trajectory, but then it completely imploded. And, his employees would just, they'd been left out of pocket, and he just felt horrific for them. He had suppliers chasing him. He had death threats, actually. His marriage ended up in tatters, and he was a broken man. And I just thought at that point, this stuff is so important. It's so important to get in there early. And we're not suggesting that any of our listeners are likely to end up in a situation that dire, but the reality is it can happen. And you just need to be aware of the signals, get in early and get the right advice. I think that's the takeaway. And that's something, I think this is a really great example you've given us of someone that was facing a dire situation in their business, but getting the right advice at the right time meant that they were able to turn it around, come to a full stop, and then start again. And hopefully when they started again, they learnt the lessons of whatever it was that, caused them to be in that situation in the first place, and were able to run the business in a different way. But, it's a terrible outcome when issues in the business pull everything down with it, and I guess that's what we all, we really all want to avoid, because there are no winners in that situation, none at all.
Yeah, and I think Richard Branson, who I like, once said, the key is if you're failing to fail fast.
Yeah.
And everybody sort of reads into things what they want to read into them. But for me, you can go through a long, drawn-out problem, or you can get on top of your problem, either lose it or win it, solve it or not solve it, but deal with it quickly, and then get on to whatever else it is that you want to achieve or you think you can achieve with your skill set, with your personal business or company moving forward.
Yeah.
The other takeaway, I think, that besides getting on top of it early, is it's important who you involve. Because the reality is in Australia is that liquidations and administrations can be a very harsh and punitive process. They can also be a very restorative and helpful process. And the same could be said with sort of using solicitors and litigation. It can work really well. You can get really good results, or it can just be an absolute nightmare for everyone.
Sure.
And the key thing, I think, and I see, and I work with a lot of solicitors, and the first and your gatekeeper is your solicitor, and you've got to go with someone who is interested with a long-term arrangement. They're not just interested in a big fee or one big job,
that's so
one
true,
big situation.
Yeah.
And
they care about you and the business for the long term. Yeah,
they care about and pick up on what your gut says about that, because then they will inevitably work with insolvency people who are like-minded. Because insolvency, ultimately, we have a lot of relationships with a lot of different people, and there's all sorts of different types of administrators and liquidators out there, just like there's all sorts of different types of solicitors out there. So when you choose your solicitor you speak to, oftentimes your solicitor will generally match up with the sort of insolvency practitioner that you're going with, and you might not need to be liquidated. You might need to be liquidated. You might need to go into administration. You might not. But all those processes can end up with you running a much more successful business on the other side, depending on how you go about it and the people you had involved.
So don't stick your head in the sand. Attack it head on. I think that's what we're saying.
Yeah,
right?
So get in there early and get in there with the right person that is in there for you and your business, as opposed to just sort of the first person that you see or in the paper. Someone that your gut tells you this person is the right person.
Love it. Well, that's been a really good discussion today, Josh. Like very heavy topics, but I just think this is such an important message for business owners to hear, because business can be hard, times can change. It's super important to be aware that in periods when you think you're most protected, you might actually be your most vulnerable. So say, for example, in those examples we talked about of fast growth, just to keep your finger on the pulse, but absolutely to get help early rather than late, not put your head in the sand. Josh, how is it that our listeners can find you if they want to talk to one of the good guys of liquidations and administrations? And of course, we have many accountants who listen in to our show as well. So how can they contact you if they'd like to?
Feel free to call or either my mobile on 0402 737 647, or the work phone is 8488 3126. That's a Sydney number. We've got an office at 175 Lower Gibbs Street in Roseville, and my email address is jtaylor@taylorinsolvency.com.au, and obviously our website, taylorinsolvency.com.au.
Cool. And we'll link straight through to Taylor Insolvency website on our website and in our show notes as well. Just wanted to say a huge thank you, Josh, for coming on to the show today. It's been really good to have you.
No worries. Thanks for having me, Joanna.
Well, that's it for this episode of Talking Law. We hope you found this episode useful and insightful. And if you'd like more information about this topic, then head over to our website at talkinglaw.com.au, where you'll be able to download a transcript of this episode, as well as any contact details and additional information that we refer to. And if you'd like to get in contact with our guest today and the services they offer, you can go ahead and check out our show notes for those details. And of course, if you're interested to talk to any of our lawyers about anything relating to this topic, then just head over to our website at www.aspectlegal.com.au, where you can book immediately a free 15-minute discussion with our legal eagles at any time that works for you. Of course, there's also a booking form in our show notes as well. And if you haven't yet, then please consider subscribing to Talking Law on your favourite podcast player to get a notification straight to your phone whenever a new episode is out. We'd also love to hear your feedback, so please leave us a review and rating if you're a subscriber, or even if you're listening to this podcast for the very first time. Well, that's it. Thanks again for listening in. This has been Joanna Oakey and Talking Law, a podcast proudly brought to you by our commercial legal practice, Aspect Legal. See you next time. Some of the most successful businesses I've worked with operate in a sale-ready state. Systems, processes, and contracts all work together to lock in and maximize value as they grow. Yes, it's easier come exit time, but in the short to medium term, it also results in smoother operations and easier management for the business owners. If you'd like to know more about what you need in place to fortify your business and lock in value as you grow, check out my new book, Buy, Grow, Exit, which is the definitive guide on just that. It is available now to buy a copy, or just check out our resources hub at buygrowexit.com.au, which of course we will also link to from this podcast show notes.
Thanks for listening to Talking Law. Tune in next time for more smart legal tips and tricks to keep you clear of those legal landmines. If you want to get a download of today's show notes, head over to talkinglaw.com.au.